I've spoken of the shining city all my political life, but I don't know if I ever quite communicated what I saw when I said it. But in my mind, it was a tall, proud city built on rocks stronger than oceans, windswept, God-blessed, and teeming with people of all kinds living in harmony and peace. A city with free ports that hummed with commerce and creativity. And if there had to be city walls, the walls had doors, and the doors were open to anyone with the will and the heart to get here. That's how I saw it and see it still.
That was President Ronald Reagan in his farewell address to the nation 30 years ago tonight. Joining us now, historian, author of The Soul of America, and Rogers Professor of the Presidency at Vanderbilt University, Jon Meacham. He writes about that speech in a new piece for The New York Times. Also with us, Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist and associate editor of The Washington Post, Eugene Robinson, and professor at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, Victoria DeFrancesco Soto. Mike Barnacle and John Heilemann are back with us as well.
Jon Meacham, Ronald Reagan there spoke of a wall, if there has to be a wall erected, doors that let people through, anybody that has the will and the desire to get here. Tell us how different Ronald Reagan's speech was and his vision of America was in 1989 than where we are 30 years later with Donald Trump.
It's kind of remarkable that the two men speak the same tongue. It's tricky to, I think, that the speeches that were given in this week from the Oval Office and President Reagan's were rendered in English together. Reagan had many faults. We'll go ahead and stipulate that, and we can move on. But he believed in this American openness, a kind of big-heartedness that, for all of his faults and all of the nation's perennial faults, was about pressing ahead, moving westward metaphorically and literally sometimes. And he absolutely believed, as he said in the peroration of the speech, that, and it's just, they're remarkable words written by our colleague Peggy Noonan, remarkable words that he said, all the pilgrims from all the lost places are hurtling through the darkness toward home. And home was America. Home was where we had lit this lamp and had created a world where you could rise on your own merit as far as that merit would take you. And that's a big-hearted, open-armed, big-spirited vision. And it's remarkable to me. The speech was perfectly lovely in real time. I remember watching it. A couple of sort of lukewarm pieces in the New York Times. Johnny Apple thought it was, not nice enough. But as so often happens with documents like that, it looms larger in retrospect now, because you read it and you realize how far we've fallen and how far we have to go back.
Especially for a party that claims to be the party of Ronald Reagan, to be the party of Abraham Lincoln. They couldn't be any further from that vision. There are some people, in fact, some of our friends, who suggest that things have changed since 1989. The facts on the ground have changed since 1989. And what Ronald Reagan said in 1989 wouldn't be said in 2019, when in fact, John, actually the more things change, the more they stay the same. The same arguments Donald Trump is making in 2019, racists and bigots have been making for 240 years, arguing that their wave of immigration to America should be the last, whether it was the Germans or whether it was the Irish or whoever the next group was that was coming.
Absolutely. And I talked to another mutual friend of ours, Craig Shirley, when I was thinking about this piece, because he knows so much about Reagan. And he was very clear that when you think about Reagan in totality, Reagan's views of immigration were clearly informed powerfully by the Cold War, by the boat people, by people fleeing the Iron Curtain. But he had also, of course, been the governor of California. And he's talked about how he believed in what we would now call amnesty, that people who'd been here for a long time and had put down roots, he was not going to send back out. He was the architect of NAFTA in many ways. He believed in this open vision of the country, not just because it was the right thing, but conservatives, as you well know, used to believe in what the Wall Street Journal called free men and free markets. Believe that the free flow of commerce, the free flow of ideas, the free flow of people created an Adam Smith-like world of prosperity. And that was the vision in which Reagan was operating. And I think this speech now, when you watch it, it really ranks now with George Washington's, with Dwight Eisenhower's, of speeches where there's a warning, there's a real watchword offered to posterity in a way that I don't think we necessarily realized when he delivered it 30 years ago today down in the Oval Office.
Willie, you know, what's so interesting is that it reflects the stark difference between Ronald Reagan's sunny optimism that America was that city shining brightly on the hill, and if anybody wants to compete with America, bring it on. We're going to beat you with open markets and free men and free women. You combine that with Donald Trump's pessimism. He's constantly preaching that we're in a world of scarcity, that people are ripping off the United States of America, and that we're just not strong enough to compete on the global stage anymore, that we've got to erect barriers to, quote, make America great again.
Yeah, far from a city on a hill, 5 minutes into his presidency during his inaugural address, he was talking about carnage in America, which turned out to be the theme of his presidency. Eugene Robinson, it's been fascinating over almost 2 years now how many times we've pulled out clips of Ronald Reagan or George H.W. Bush or Bob Dole, Republicans all, and compared that version of republicanism. Not long ago, we played the clip of Bob Dole at his acceptance speech at the 1996 Republican Convention in San Diego, where he said, in strong contrast to what President Trump said 22 years later or so, if you believe that this party, this Republican Party, is not open to all races and religions, the exits are clearly marked. I encourage you to leave now.
And today we have Steve King.
Right.
We have Steve King embracing white supremacy. That's today's Republican Party. None of those, would any of those earlier Republicans be welcome in today's Republican Party? I think the answer is no. They would be considered snowflakes. You know, just to point out is about the Reagan speech, the world was a dirtier, more brutish, nastier place then, actually. I mean, if you look at all the sort of indicators of quality of life around the world, the world was worse, objectively worse then than it is now for most people. Yet we had this sort of embracing, welcoming vision as expressed by Reagan and as believed by most Americans. And yet now we have Donald Trump. It's an astonishing fall.
You know, Jon Meacham, sitting here watching that clip, it does something to you. It snaps you back into a distant time across all the dust of the years past. And you realize that it was a TV visual incarnation of FDR's fireside chats to the nation, in a sense. And you realize suddenly that despite whatever disagreements you may have had with President Reagan during the Reagan administration with some of their policies, that one of the primary tasks, and an important one of any president, is the ability to communicate to the people of this country some sense of optimism, some sense of the future that we are all going to endure, go through, and hopefully prosper with. And we've lost that.
We've lost it, and there is no lost and found at the moment. And one of the things, you're right about the dust of the years and the distance. And one of the things that I really want to emphasize, and I believe as strongly as I believe anything, is we can learn from moments like this, despite the fact that we have a natural sentimental reaction to them. This conversation is not based on nostalgia. It is based on a real understanding that Ronald Reagan was a tumultuous political figure, Not everybody agreed with him, though he did carry 49 states in 1984, which is like talking about Agincourt. I mean, imagine carrying 49 states now. But on the same day, the news in the paper, in the Times, of the speech was covered and the transcript was published, Bill Safire, conservative columnist, writes a very tough column about how Reagan had a great first term, but boy, the second term was regrettable. And now we look at him as you say, Mike, in this kind of FDR sense, as someone who, even though you might disagree with him strongly, represented a part of the country as a whole in a way that everyone could at least acknowledge his heart was in the right place. And I think that's what we are missing. 40% of this country couldn't say Franklin Roosevelt's name. You know, they called him that man. People wanted Reagan impeached because of Iran-Contra. So we're not being, this is not a, again, nostalgic exercise, Nick at night meets C-SPAN in the morning. All right, put that aside. But this is a real look at words spoken by an American president 30 years ago that are diametrically opposite from the words that could be spoken by the President of the United States today. And that does force us to say, to think, what happened, and if you don't like what's happened, how do you fix it?
So, Victoria, if Ronald Reagan's speech, just those words, if they captured the American spirit, at the very least, no matter what you thought of his policies, of goodness and inclusion and love, how would you characterize what Donald Trump's trip to the border yesterday is, and also the words he's using and the move he may make to use disaster relief funds, some that should be going to Puerto Rico, to pay for this wall? What is he saying to the world and to people desperately seeking asylum here?
Right. So, Mika, when we talk about the wall and the way Trump talks about the wall, I think there are two dimensions here. The first is the ideological one. And for me, when I think about a wall, I think about a tombstone. We were talking about the optimism that we saw in the words of Ronald Reagan, of other leaders in our country, about doors, about bringing people in, about being a beacon. Whereas the wall, if we erect that wall, it is basically placing a tombstone and saying, you know what? Everything we believe for, it's gone. It's dead. It's buried. And then there's the practical side of it. There's the economic pain that we are inflicting on our country. Yeah. Because it's not just the $5 billion that President Trump is asking for. There's a much larger cost to, quote unquote, the wall. There is the maintenance of the wall. There are the legal battles of the eminent domain for the wall. There is the commerce that's going to be hurt on the border region. And the fact is, the wall that's already been built isn't the easiest part. So the estimates that are given are way under what it's actually going to cost. So we're hurting our country, I think, morally, but also in the pocketbook of every single one of us.
Hey, Victoria, it's Jon Heilemann here. I just want you to expand a little bit on one of the points you just made, which is this eminent domain point where, you know, in every other case known to man, Republicans, conservatives are always in opposition to the notion the federal government can just take private land through the use of eminent domain. And yet, for some reason, in this one instance, apparently, it's okay. Talk a little bit about that ideological inconsistency / hypocrisy.
And I think there's an even larger hypocrisy, John, because here in Texas, it's the come and take it state. So, I mean, our land, we will fight you for it, as we did in the, you know, the Mexican-American War. But what we see is the president saying, hey, Americans on the border, we don't care about your rights. We have a bigger issue, which is erecting this tombstone, which is the border wall. And it's going to be so costly because Texans have been fighting this for a long time, going back to the Secure Fence Act of 2007. We still haven't resolved all of the legal issues there. So we have, again, the moral piece of it, you're trying to take my land, and the fiscal piece of it. There's one case of a family on the border. The land has been in their family since the late 1700s. It was a Spanish land grant, and these folks are saying, you are not taking my land away, and we are going to fight tooth and nail. And you're going to see that with every border dweller. So again, the logistical and the moral piece, absurd.
All right, Victoria DeFrancesco Soto, thank you very much for being on this morning.